Good afternoon, or even good morning, everybody. I'm here to talk about some of the data behind the stories, much of which I'm sure will be familiar to you, but some may be new. I leave it to you to decide whether this is the truth or not. And I kind of feel I probably should be wearing a white lab coat to go with all of the graphs I'm going to be running through in rapid, quick succession when my presentation is put up. There it is, excellent. So the last time the world's government sat down collectively to look at what was happening around biodiversity, and you may or may not be able to see this, this is what was put in front of them. And the story goes something like this. There's never been more effort and action in support of biodiversity, but at the same time, globally, pressures on biodiversity have not been declining, whereas the aggregate indices of biodiversity itself surely still are declining. Now let's zoom in a bit. That's global, that's very broad brush. Let's look at the UK. Changing State of Nature report from this year. Again, one of the headlines, this is looking at some of the priority species in the UK, and it's a fabulously declining curve. These species, this suite of important priority species, declining by an average 77% over the period of the last 5 decades. Let's look again a bit closer still. If you look across the 3,000 or more species that were reviewed and surveyed and monitored as part of this, we see that yes, 60% or so have been in decline, but clearly quite a number happens. The story is far more mixed than it may otherwise look if you look at purely the negative headlines. Let's look at birds, which are one of the things that inevitably we know most about, both in the UK and worldwide. This is from UK farmland birds. Some kinds of birds very clearly in decline over this period of time. These are the specialists, the ones that are find it much more difficult to cope with the change. Those which are generalists, we find pretty much holding their own over this period. And of course, there are others that are recovering. This is a story of a bird that has done very well through the actions we put in place to change management practices in favour of its populations. We see similar success stories, good news stories in other species, otters and the like. So we need to look behind those overall broad brush headlines. To take another suite of information that's been released this year, this is the annual suite of biodiversity indicators that DEFRA JNCC compiled with the stats offices. Again, you'll be very familiar with this, I'm sure. This covers a far broader suite of metrics and indicators than purely looking at species and population change. And although you won't be able to see the detail, I hope you can see that there are some, within these traffic lights, some green circles, some red circles, and some orange circles. Some things are getting better, some are getting worse, some are staying the same. And if we condense that, we can see that on balance, whether you look in the short term, the far side, which is over the past 5 years or so, or you look at the longer term, we see a similar kind of balance of some things that are improving. And our performance here, particularly around pollution control, fresh water, some fisheries management, we're seeing some improvements. In other areas, of course, we're not. Invasive species is one good example of that. So there's still very much room for improvement. And if we go beyond that, then into another report I'm sure you'll be very familiar with from a couple of years ago, which is the UK National Ecosystem Assessment, which 500 scientists working over a couple of years to try and get a picture across the various marine and terrestrial habitats within the UK at the various benefits, ecosystem services as they're known in the jargon, that we as a society benefit from or obtain from nature in various ways, whether that is the things that we grow, the things that we chop down or dig up, whether it's the experiences we have engaging with nature, whether it's the fresh water, whether it's the provision of protection through storm surge protection, tidal flows, whether it's erosion control, whether it's soils and productivity, a whole range of things. And as you can see, again, massively mixed picture, huge amount of detail going into this, but with a big headline, which is that overall 30% of our ecosystem services are one way or another in decline. But again, the other side of the story, and this study did quite a lot of work looking at modelling futures, looking at how policy decisions might influence the future of nature and its values for us, suggests that there are things that we can do that can make a real difference. And in fact, the future could be more positive than these inevitably declining trends might always present to us. So in terms of success stories, well, as we've heard, success depends on your point of view in many ways. But if we're thinking about success from the perspective of biodiversity and biodiversity change, and trying to move us in a more positive direction, then I've already mentioned one or two, the species that we are actively managing to recover, if you like. Some of our efforts and regulations around pollution and other kinds of things. I've highlighted a few more, which I'll go back globally for some of these. And one is around one of the things that conservationists and governments do most, which is to establish protected areas, to highlight areas of importance and to provide some form of legislation or other management control to them. Now, we've seen massive increases in areas protected, whether they are protected de facto on the ground or whether it's just a paper park, of course we can argue about. We've seen massive increases, but more importantly what we're seeing is that increasingly we're recognizing where the important biodiversity is from a global perspective, and we're targeting where we put our protected areas in a much more effective way than we previously were. So rather than simply putting parks in areas that are potentially empty or large wilderness areas, we're looking at where the things are that society is saying is important, and we're protecting those a bit more effectively. And that goes for important bird areas, that's the BirdLife International designation, Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, which is another form of prioritisation, sites called the last strongholds for critically endangered species. But we're seeing the same thing in terms of community conserved areas. Far greater recognition and identification of areas that communities around the world see as important and are managing for nature in one way or another. That's one potential success. Another that I want to highlight, and this will relate to something Simon will take far more further forward in his presentation, is globally awareness of biodiversity. And again, without arguing about the term, whether biodiversity is a storytelling term is a good one, we're actually seeing slight increases in proportion of populations that actually have heard of biodiversity and know what it is. And I think the figures, the top ones there, the green and yellow from Brazil, are particularly important. This is not just something that's sort of happening within Europe, if you like. Brazil and other countries that are emerging have very high rates of recognition of these concepts. And that is a starting point, of course, for then affecting change, getting engagement and getting action. Not just Simon, I think, will take the debate in his presentation. Something else that I think stems from that, and here is another example from Brazil, is that through the democratization of information, if you like, through the sharing of information on environmental change, we're actually seeing really positive action. Now, this is a story from the Amazon which shows that over the course of less than a decade, in recent years, we've seen a massive, massive decline in rates of deforestation. Now, why is that? A number of factors, of course, but one of the things that's happened in this period is that we've become far better at near real-time monitoring of forest change through satellite information that is now being put out in Brazil in near real time for public availability and consumption, and which is being used alongside law enforcement efforts to really hit home where the deforestation is taking place. And as part of an effort to effect change, having this very clear, unambiguous data on change and rates of change and where it's happening is a big part of helping us to then move things in a clearer direction. Now, I wish I'd known what we'd have been talking about this morning and what Tim was going to say before I put this example up. The issue about restoration. We talk about declines and we talk about halting declines, but what we're seeing is, and whether you agree with the approach or this particular example, whether you talk in the context of rewilding, the point here is that we can change the trajectory of nature if we want to. And yes, it has to be managed, but we are seeing examples like this, like the Great Fen, happening increasingly. And whether it's happening through active intervention of people and management, or whether it's happening through some form of managed retreats, nature changes, nature evolves. And we're seeing this kind of thing happening. We need to pull these kind of stories out so we don't get stuck at the aggregate global headlines, which can lead us to a conclusion that whatever we do, we're not going to achieve the success we're looking for. Now, I've got very little time left. I was asked to talk about some of the emerging issues. And I think the one thing I want to say here is around nature and changing nature. Nature changes, it is in flux. We're very good when we're looking at monitoring and data and the science behind this, at looking backwards and looking at where we are. And we've got to get far better at looking forwards. One of the things that's going to happen is that climate change is going to change the niches that species can exist in. We're already seeing movements of species in response to climate change. So there are going to be things that we're not going to be able to restore in certain places. There are communities that are going to change as a result of things that we are going to have a great impact on in the short term. Do we understand that, and do we understand the implications? That's key. Equally looking forward, the big issue of how we think about nature in the context of society and economies. And this is not a new theme or a new story, but as we go forward, we're clearly looking at a world that's focused very much on food security, energy security, and water security. Where does biodiversity fit in that? Do we understand clearly the implications of change? When we look at agriculture, Africa, we still, on one side of our brains, think of Africa in terms of a wilderness full of canoes. On the other side, it's going to turn into a farm for all sorts of reasons. How do we fit biodiversity into that, and what are the implications of not thinking in those kinds of ways? That's key. And finally, I've talked very quickly through some of the data we have. There's masses of data, but are we using that effectively? Do we have the right kind of data? The UK is data rich, but it also, and the UK national ecosystem is a good example of this, relies still very much on expert opinion. Now, whether that is the expert sitting in their ivory tower or whether it is the expert farming their fields, there's a lot of knowledge that doesn't always get translated into statistics and facts and graphs. How do we draw that into the decision-making processes? This is a big topic of discussion right now. Equally, how do we improve the flow of the right kinds of information from those places which are currently very information scarce? There's an amount you can do with satellites, there's an amount you've got to do by getting out there on the ground. Citizen science here is a particularly big issue. A lot of the data we have in the UK is volunteer-driven. It's people going out there and looking at what's happening and telling other people about it and bringing it together. It's not all done by scientists. Can we see the same transition elsewhere in the world? And in particular here, if we want to get better decisions, we've got to think about the decision makers we're aiming this at. We're very good in the biodiversity sector at talking to ourselves. We're very good at talking to the environment ministries, but are we yet really talking to the development ministries, the finance ministries, the treasuries, those parts of government that really have an impact on what's happening over there? We've got to be able to use this information to convince them that there are ways that they can change and ways that we can build biodiversity in and make rather more space for nature. Now, as I said, some of this you've seen before. All of it is available one way or another through the web, through electronic sources. One of the things that's quite new is the latest update on the global indicators that are being used by governments under the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's one of the pillars that we maintain. It's available through smartphone apps as well as other sources. If you're interested in more of what's happening at that level, then I'd encourage you to go there. Thank you very much.